In today's video, we'll be talking about legendary teacher Konstantin Stanislavski and the creation of the Moscow Art Theater. Welcome back, theater kids. My name is Heather, and I am glad you are here today. Today, we're going to be taking a look at one of the most influential figures in the history of theater, and that is Stanislavski. So we're going to actually be looking at a couple of different texts, so let's get our source on. The first source we're going to be looking at is The Path of the Modern Russian Stage and Other Essays by Alexander Bakshi. Now, this is available for free to read on archive.org. There will be a link down in the description below if you would like to take a look at this for yourself. The second source we're going to be using is Great Acting Teachers and Their Methods, and this is by Richard Brestoff. I'm going to have a link down below in the description of this as well, where you can find it on Amazon and check out this text for yourself. And if you're ready, let's get started. So we're going to start by talking about chapter 2 and 3 of Alexander Bakshi's essays about the path of the modern Russian stage, where specifically he talks about Stanislavski and the creation of the Moscow Art Theater. Now, the Moscow Art Theater started off as just an idea. These were individuals who were devoted to their craft, and they were not satisfied with the current state of theater in Russia. So they decided that they wanted to be the change that they saw in the world. So they collected just enough money to get started. And believe me, they heard no from a lot of people. They went to a lot of potential patrons and finally were able to get just enough yeses to get a little bit of money so that they could get started. They found a rundown theater that nobody was using anymore. And the two main founders of the theater, who were Dachenko and Stanislavski, they began delegating responsibilities between the two of them, deciding who would be in charge of what. So Dachenko was given veto power in literary matters. He was able to decide exactly which shows they were going to put on, while Stanislavski had veto power in the more artistic matters. So he got to decide how those plays were acted and produced. If you were going to be an actor within the Moscow Art Theater, then there were some rules that you had to follow. You had to basically obey every single thing that Stanislavski asked you to do acting-wise. And one of the big things was that any part that was offered to you, you could not turn it down. So if you were offered a role, that was it. That was the role that you were going to play. These actors gave up very good jobs in order to take just a little bit of money and act with the MAT. So this was something that really meant a lot to the actors that were there. And after 4 months of rehearsals, they were able to put on their first production. It had a lot of success. Everything was going well. However, the next few productions, not as great. Very few ticket sales, very small audiences, and so it looked like the theater might have been destined to fail. However, Dachenko decided to produce Chekhov's The Seagull. Now, this was something that had been produced in a few other theaters and had never gone really well because it's not exactly an action-filled play. It's really a lot of talking. But he decided that that was the one they were going to do. Stanislavski staged it, and it was a huge success. This was a big turning point for the MAT. They finally were able to become the most popular theater in Russia. For the next few performances that they did, people would literally camp out in the streets overnight in order to get tickets for upcoming productions. Bakshi, our author, actually attributes this to the fact that he believes Russians to be a little more open-minded about receiving original work than we are in other countries. Another thing that worked really well for them was that the actors really became the characters. They didn't just portray a character, they went as naturalistic as possible. The theater was really founded on the idea that naturalism was the best way to move Russian literature and the art of theater forward. They were focused on naturalism, but as more and more literature started to lean towards symbolism, they started to go a little more symbolic in their acting style. He finishes off by talking about the theater's stress on ensemble acting and that Stanislavski kind of worked more as a dictator than he did an actual director. Despite all of this, the Moscow Art Theater produced some of Russia's greatest actors. Sometimes these plays were rehearsed for months, even in one case up to an entire year of rehearsals before they're presented to the public. And it usually cost a lot of money for them to be able to rehearse that long and then put it on for just a handful of shows. So having talked about that, let's talk a little bit more about Stanislavski in particular with our next text. We're now going to take a look at Chapter 2 of The Great Acting Teachers and Their Methods by Brestov, where he talks specifically about the Russian Revolution. He starts by giving us a picture of Stanislavski's background. He started acting at a young age, but acting at that point just meant imitating what he'd seen other people do before. He loved being on stage, but he didn't understand why he wasn't so successful at it. He spent a lot of time studying and practicing, but even after lots of practice, he spoke too quickly. He would drop the ends of words. He would gesture wildly. He would force his emotions, and he always felt really tense on stage. Eventually, he was accepted into the Imperial Dramatic School of Moscow, but dropped out after only a few weeks because he realized his teachers just wanted him to copy them the same way that they had copied their teachers before them. He said that acting has to be more than just copying something, but he didn't know what it was. So he experimented with a lot of different methods. Even at one point, asking his friends to lock him into the cellar of a French castle to better understand the role that he was trying to play. Nothing was working. So he realized there must be some sort of mind-body connection that he was missing. He just wasn't sure what it was. So in 1897, when they set up the Moscow Art Theater, which we just talked about, they had an uneasy kind of tense understanding that they would divide the power of literary and artistic leadership with absolute veto powers given to each person. And though they found success, he could not really feel the characters that he was portraying. He was relying on muscle memory to perform. So he left the MIT in 1906 because he wanted to rethink directing and acting and what it all meant. So he ended up settling in Finland, where he started to think about what allows the great actors that he knows of to portray the same character for extended periods of time and still keep it fresh every time. So he said there must be some sort of relaxation and concentration that connects to a truthful performance. So from there, the author actually takes us through the essential points of the method that Stanislavski had developed, but he does it through the voice of Thespis, who we all know is the Greek founder of acting, and he has Thespis take us through each one of these points and explain them, which I found really, really interesting to read. So if you have a chance to actually read this for yourself, I absolutely recommend it. So he talks about some of the points that are essential according to Stanislavski, starting with relaxation. You have to release the tension in your body. Second is mind, will, and emotion. These are the pillars of the inner landscape of a character. Third is going to be your concentration. You need to concentrate on what it is you want your audience to see. If you're not concentrating on the character, the audience is never going to see it. Fourth, you need to think about public solitude. You need to behave in a way that you are not being watched. So that makes things as natural as possible. Don't be aware that the audience is there. Don't do something for their benefit. Do it for the character's benefit. Sensory recall. You need to recall experiences from your own senses in order to recreate them. Next is imagination. You need to have the ability to create what does not actually exist. Next is the magic if, and that's very closely related. You have to allow yourself to become what you yourself are not. Next is circumstances. What is it like to be in the actual world of that character? Action. What is your character doing and why are they doing it? Objective. What does your character want in this scene? Then you have your super objective. What does your character want over the course of the entire play, and how does that fit into their objectives? The through line of action. All the actions of your character need to be leading towards that super objective. Next is emotional memory. Recall an emotional experience that you've had that is similar to that of your character and be able to pull that from your mind and re-experience it. A lot of people consider this to be one of the most controversial points of his method. Next, we have communion. Make sure that you are actually connecting with your other actors on stage. Adaptation. You have to shift your objectives according to the circumstances of what's happening in the show. And finally, your tempo and rhythm. You need to find the speed and the specific beats of the scene. Now, once Stanislavski came up with all these, it did not remain static. He was constantly revising these things all the way to his death, and to this day, it is still considered a baseline for all discussions on the craft of acting. And finally, let's just talk a little bit about what I got out of the reading. In our first selection, one of the things that I took away was the initial search for funding of the theater, just knowing that they had to be told no so many times before they had just the smallest amount of financial support. But they believed in this idea, so that's how they were able to make it work. Next, they talked a lot about the detail that they put in order to make their productions more real, even going so far as to research specific type of lighting fixtures that they would have in the room, or just have various little items and knickknacks lying around the set to make the set look like somebody actually lived in it. And finally, I was really interested in the fact that Russian audiences don't usually watch a lot of long-term engagements. They would spend months and months and months and do maybe just one weekend of shows. And this is really a whole lot like directing high school or really any educational or community theater, where you'll rehearse for a really long time for just a handful of shows. From our second piece, I really liked hearing a lot of Stanislavski's background. You always hear of him as he appeared as the giant of theater that he was in the later parts of his life, but I never really heard a lot before about his earlier years. So I found that really interesting about how he was seeing theater as just an imitation of things and how he really sought to change that. It was really interesting to get also an alternative perspective to the creation of the Moscow Art Theater, because the way that it was described was just a little bit different between the two authors that I read this week. And I loved the way that he used Thespis to explain the points of Stanislavski's method. This is, I think, a really good way. The way that it's broken down in this book is probably a really good way to break it down and explain it to theater students, if that's something that you're doing. If you're wanting to educate in theater, this is probably a good start at breaking down the method. And it's very similar to the way that I was taught the method in my early acting classes when I got to college. A lot of this focused on Stanislavski's method and adapting and using that. So it's still in use today. It is still being used, and just finding a way to break it down and make it digestible. This was something that I think really helped for that. So there you go. Those are this week's readings and my thoughts on them. So why don't you let me know what you think about it down in the comments below. While you're there, you might as well subscribe to the channel. It doesn't cost you a thing. Click that button and it keeps you up to date on all the other content that I have coming out all the time. But that is all for this week. I will talk to you again soon, and scene.